Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a really special guest and we're going to be talking about something a little bit different than we usually do because he's coming from a substance use background. His name's Dr. Frank and I'm going to send it right over to him to give an introduction that I can't butcher. Hey Dr.
Yeah,
Frank, how's
of
it going?
course. Rob, it's great. It's going well, man. Thanks for having me on your channel. Yeah, so I come from a background of my main addictions were nicotine, THC, energy drinks slash stimulants, and then media content, particularly adult media content. And I had a cross between all those. Now, ironically enough, gambling was never a really big thing for me, but I know that there's a lot of people that I've interacted with who struggled with cannabis addiction or nicotine addiction or alcohol addiction who also had problems when it came to gambling addiction. For one reason or another, for myself, though, gambling never really hit my radar too much. But I don't think these addictions are all that different. You know, it's funny when I make videos on my channel talking about substances, I'll make a video specific to weed or specific to nicotine or particularly focused on alcohol. But across the board, from my experience, a lot of the outcomes, a lot of the feelings, a lot of the brain chemistry, it seems to be pretty similar. So I think it's neat being on a gambling channel, getting to talk about what I experienced with weed addiction, nicotine addiction, media content addiction on a gambling channel, because I think there's a lot of similarities between them. But yeah, I struggled with that stuff for a period of about, 9 years. I quit around the age of 27. I'm 35 now. And similar to what you do, I have a channel, Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching, and we're focused on helping people quit nicotine, weed, energy drinks, stimulants, and adult media content. That's really what we do.
So, I mean, you touch on there's a lot of overlap between these addictions. Is there anything that's like particularly in your eyes different about a gambling addiction compared to those substance use addictions?
You know, it's funny when I think about gambling addictions, I think to myself, gosh, how could someone do that? Like, you're just losing money at such a rapid rate. But then I look in the mirror and I look at what I was doing to myself and I'm like, wow, people probably thought the same thing. Gosh, how could someone smoke all that weed? How could someone get sick from consuming that much nicotine at once? That would seem ludicrous.
Sure.
I think the crossover comes down to probably the chemistry of addiction, right? So I assume in gambling, you're chasing that dopamine rush, that next hit, which comes in the form of currency. In my case, I was chasing it in a joint or a blunt or a cartridge or a drink or that next video online. So
Mm.
I think a lot of it comes down to just how dopamine works in the brain. I think a lot of it comes down to wanting to change our emotional and physical state of being in any given moment. I think there's that crossover, right? I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm going to go get high. I want to celebrate, I'm going to go get high. I figure it's probably similar for gambling, not too far off, right? I'm
Oh
super
yeah.
stressed about this situation. I'm going to go gamble to change how I feel physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever it may be. So I think there's a ton of crossover. And then where there's probably the biggest crossover, which is what I find on my channels, is the impacts, the side effects of these addictions, I think across the board look the same. I know I've talked to you on my channel before, and I asked you about like, did it impact your relationships or your
Mm.
physical health or your mental health? And your answer was yes. And a lot of times when I'm talking to people about substances and how there's similarities, it's like, yeah, I struggled with weed, but I could relate to the person who struggled with gambling and that like they've spent a lot of money on it. And
Mm.
financially, it's created a lot of financial stress in their life, right? When you're combining weed, alcohol, nicotine, stimulants, these things aren't cheap. So there's a financial burden. Those finances can definitely have an impact on a person's relationship. And then you can start to see the side effects of addiction negatively impacting that. Definitely, once my mental health declined, my physical health declined rapidly, right? Like I lost interest in the gym. I lost interest in basic self care routines as that depression kind of set in. So it's funny. I think no matter what the addiction is, maybe outside of overdose potential, right? You can't necessarily overdose on gambling. I don't know anyone who's overdosed on weed, but outside of overdose potential, unlike heroin or alcohol where you could overdose, I think the outcomes look the same. And I could probably even argue overdose potential for gambling and weed, right? Someone loses enough money. Now perhaps they're faced with suicidal ideation and God forbid, maybe following through with that. And we've definitely seen it with cannabis where people go into an acute state of psychosis and take their own life.
Mm.
So I could maybe even argue for overdose potential it's different how we get there depending on the drug, but the end outcome could ultimately be the same, I suppose. So yeah, I think that's where you see the most crossover, the outcomes of the addiction and how it works in the person's brain chemistry.
Sure.
That's what fascinates me.
My sponsor is actually in recovery from alcohol, drugs, and gambling. And what he says is that he was always in the business of trying to feel better, trying to feel different. And that's exactly how I felt with the gambling itself. Now, to someone that's watching and they may be trying to quit gambling, should they also be trying to stop drinking or using drugs if they feel like there might be a link between them?
Yeah, it's funny. People ask me that all the time. I always say to people, look, start with the thing that's impacting you the most negatively. So let's say you get high, and then after getting high, you start binging adult media content and media content, and then that high drops down, and you're like, okay, I got to pick myself up, and then you go gamble. So it's like,
Mm,
okay, if I can tie that behavior back to weed, like every time the person smokes, it brings them down this negative rabbit hole. Well, then I would argue start by quitting weed, and hopefully your interest in those other things naturally starts to die off, right? You hear this
mm,
with alcohol too sometimes. Oh, I drank alcohol, and before I knew it, I was out looking for a cigarette. And then after I had the cigarette, I was out looking for a bump of cocaine. And
mm.
it's like, okay, so it sounds like alcohol was the initiating factor in all those other behaviors. So I always tell people try and identify the thing that's causing you the most trouble first, start there, and then hopefully the other things are going to fall in line. Because I know for me, like the principles and the ideology that I use to quit using cannabis, I just quickly transferred over shortly thereafter to nicotine, adult
Mhm.
media content. I use the same principles today. If my eating gets out of control and I'm binging on food or something, I use the same things I learned about quitting weed and quitting nicotine and quitting adult media content to regulate my food intake. Like just okay, this is teetering on the side of a poor behavior. So yeah, to answer your question, and I'm more a fan of saying pick one thing first because it's not as overwhelming either too, right? Like if I'm going to talk to someone and say, okay, you got to quit gambling, you got to quit smoking weed, you got to quit cigarettes, you got to quit watching porn, when maybe they only smoked one or two cigarettes a week, maybe adult media content isn't negatively impacting their life at this time in any major way, it's not a major issue for them. I think sometimes people become overwhelmed at the idea of having to remake their entire life in a day, when it's like, look, these destructive behaviors built up over years. It's going
Sure.
to take more than a day to correct all this. So I'm a fan of picking one thing, starting there, the thing that seems to be at the root of everything else, and then going from there. So like I guess gambling would be maybe the person gambles a lot, loses a ton of money, and then they smoke and drink to cope with those financial losses. Smoking and drinking continually have that negative impact on the brain, decision making, delayed gratification, and then it just funnels them right back into gambling again. But in that case, it's like, well, it sounds like it started with gambling and then you were using other substances to cope with the side effects of gambling. So, does that make sense? Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think it did. And you know what? It leads me into kind of another thought that I was having, which is I think it's just really damn impressive that you decided to take what was dragging you down and create your profession to try to help other people avoid doing the same. Now, that's kind of the mindset of my page, which is we're most qualified to help the person that we used to be. What kind of value do you think it provides to your own recovery to coach patients to live better lives themselves?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously valuable on a bunch of different levels. I think the biggest level that's valuable on is just helping people. It gives you that dopamine rush. The way that I do it via social media, much like yourself, I'd be lying if I said I don't get a dopamine hit when I see the views, when I see the likes, when I see the emails coming in of people that I help. I personally have no problem with that dopamine hit. It's been
Me
beneficial
too.
to me from a career standpoint. It's benefited other people, and it's made my life better, and it's made other people's lives better, and we've all benefited in the process of that. Everyone that I've worked with, including myself, has benefited. So I think that's tremendously valuable. I think the value in helping others too, especially because I did turn it into somewhat of a business, right? I mean, I quit weed, and I turned quitting weed into a business. And a lot of my attention went from how don't I smoke weed or the craving of weed to how do I get better sound quality on my YouTube channel? How do I make this video titled better? Actually, it's funny because in helping others stop, in the way that I did it, it furthermore took me out of that space of addiction.
Mm,
It's very rare outside of my coaching calls or things like that that I'm talking about addiction. A lot of people see my channel and they might think all this guy talks about is weed and quitting weed and stopping using drugs. And that's not true. If you knew me outside of this, I'm much more into fitness nowadays. I'm much more into, growing YouTube channels and different business things. So for me personally, that's been, I think, just a tremendous benefit. It was weird in a sense, talking about the addiction, helping others get away from the addiction and building a business out of it really took me away from it. But like,
mm,
on the same note, I could say maybe more personal to the addiction side. I think it's good because you get to help people and it kind of reinforces the benefits of quitting, right? So you help someone
mm,
quit and you see how well they're doing. And it's like, oh, that's positive. That's just motivating for me too. Seeing someone else do well is just continuous motivation for myself to stay on the right track.
mm,
And on the other note, that's kind of more depressing is I do come across people who still struggle with things, who can't seem to figure it out yet, who really struggle with it. And it's kind of a staunch reminder for me personally of not to go back.
mm,
And as much as I hate to say that, that's the reality. And when I was involved in more group stuff, there was two benefits to group settings in my opinion, and I get the same benefits out of doing my coaching. I'd see people that I could relate to, and that relatability meant the world, and they could give me their lived experiences and how they handled situations, and it was tremendously valuable to me. And then I'd see people who wouldn't do so well, and I mean, I want to see everyone do well, but reality is some people don't, or it takes them a longer time. And seeing others not do well was also like, ooh, maybe I don't need to make that mistake. John made that mistake of going back to it. Maybe I'm not going to do that because that didn't work out so good for John Doe or whoever it was.
mm.
So yeah, kind of a weird series of benefits and consequences that I've seen over the years doing this.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing all that. Thank you so much for being on today. And I hope that this is the first conversation of many that we can have here on my account and as well as your account, Addiction Mindset. Tell the people where they can find you, what platforms, and why they should be following your account.
Yeah, it's YouTube is the best platform. Addiction mindset, it's all one word. You could split it up into two words and it'd probably still pop up. And then on TikTok, it's Doc Frank here, DocFrankHere. And YouTube and TikTok is definitely where you can find us. Instagram, we also have the Addiction Mindset account as well too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on.
I appreciate it, Rob. Thanks.